In the heart of America's great Northwest lumberjack country, there once lived a man named Paul Bunyan. And this Paul Bunyan was no ordinary lumberjack. No siree. He was the biggest, baddest, most tremendous lumberjack that ever did or ever will or ever could do anything. Why, he was so big that if he stood up straight, he'd be taller than the Washington Monument, the Gateway Arch, and me. And some people say he was even taller than Mount Rushmore. And then there was Babe. Now, Babe was Paul Bunyan's ox, and he was big, bigger than any ox that ever existed. In fact, he was so big that if he wanted to, he could kick an anthill all the way to Canada. His horns were as long as canoe paddles. They were. And his hooves were so large that when he walked through the forest, it sounded like distant thunder. In fact, one time when Babe took a step, he accidentally created a small earthquake that nearly leveled the town of Bangor, Maine. Oh, it was terrible. But Babe was so sorry about it that he helped everyone rebuild their homes with his massive, strong back. Well, except for Old Man Jenkins, who refused to let Babe help him rebuild his outhouse. "I built it myself," he said, "and by God, I'll fix it myself." So Babe just stared at him for a moment, and then he let out a giant belch that smelled like sour milk and wet dog. And that was the end of that. One time Paul Bunyan and his ox Babe were hired to cut down all the trees in the Grand Canyon so that the Pacific Ocean could drain all the swampland in Arizona. Now, this was a big job, and it would take many years to complete. But Paul Bunyan wasn't worried. He had his trusty axe, Betsy, and he was the greatest axe thrower that ever did or ever will or ever could throw an axe. In fact, one time Paul threw his axe so hard that it landed in outer space where it became the moon. Yes, sir. That was Paul Bunyan's axe. Well, anyway, after working for many weeks, Paul Bunyan and his crew had only made a very small dent in the forest. They were tired and frustrated and hungry, and Babe was tired of eating ants. So they decided to take a break and go find something to eat. But there wasn't anything around for miles and miles except for a small patch of grass by the river. But by the time they got there, it was already trampled by thousands of stampeding elk. So Babe was pretty hungry. And then he looked up at the tall canyon walls, and an idea came to his big, bovine brain. "Hey, Paul," he said, "why do we drag your axe up the canyon wall and make a new river? I can water these thirsty trees and maybe even grow a nice juicy patch of grass for us to eat." Paul thought this was a great idea. "It'll also give us a shortcut to the other side of the canyon," he said, "so we won't have to walk all the way around." So Paul put his shoulder under Betsy and heaved. He tried to lift his axe and start dragging it up the canyon wall. But Betsy was very heavy. She was made of solid steel and had a thick layer of sawdust on her blade. Paul grunted and strained and pulled with all his might, but he couldn't budge her. "Need some help, Paul?" Babe asked. "Sure could use a little," Paul replied. "Okay, hop on my back." So Paul climbed onto Babe's broad back and wrapped his legs around his horns. Then Babe stomped his right foot, then his left foot, and then he started walking sideways up the canyon wall. Paul grabbed Betsy by the handle and dug his shoulder into her head as hard as he could, and they started dragging their axe up the canyon wall. At first it went very slowly, but then they started picking up the pace. The axe bit into the rock and dirt and scraped and clawed its way higher and higher. Little pebbles flew everywhere and the ground trembled beneath them. "Heave ho, heave ho!" Paul shouted as he dug his shoulder into Babe's thick fur. "Just a little higher, Babe, just a little higher." Babe snorted and puffed out his chest and began to climb even faster. The wind howled through his fur as he climbed higher and higher. Soon they reached the top of the canyon wall, and they looked down at the amazing view before them. Below them, the river sparkled like a silver ribbon in the sunlight, and the trees looked like tiny green needles from up here. "Well, Babe, we made it," Paul said, chuckling. "You sure did, Paul," Babe replied. "But now how are we going to get back down?" Paul thought for a moment. "I guess we could just walk back around the canyon rim," he said. "Yeah, but that would take forever," Babe replied. "We should just slide down this thing," he said, pointing his nose toward Betsy. "Good idea, Babe," Paul said, and the two friends slid down the canyon wall on their axe. They went very fast and was lots of fun, but it was also very dangerous. Rocks and dirt flew up and hit them in the face, and they had to dodge falling trees that were dislodged by Babe's hooves. But finally they reached the bottom safely, and they were both very excited. "Look at that, Paul," Babe said. "We made a new river, and we only took one good swipe from Betsy." "Sure did, Babe," Paul replied. "Now those trees are gone, Nah, grow so tall and so thick that the Pacific Ocean will never get through this forest. Babe and Paul high-fived, and then they raced off into the woods to tell their friends about their amazing accomplishment. Meanwhile, Betsy was very thirsty after all her hard work, so she took a long drink from the new river. And as she drank, she noticed that the water was turning brown and dirty. And as she drank more and more, she became very sick. "Oh no," she said, "this water is poisoned." Just then, Paul and Babe came running back. "What's wrong, Betsy?" Paul asked. "This river, it's poisonous," Betsy said. "If anyone drinks it, they'll turn into a babbling brook." "Oh no," Paul said, "that'll never do." He knew that the only way to save his friends was to use his axe to dig a new river to replace the old one. So Paul put his shoulder under Betsy and heaved. He tried to lift his axe and start digging, but it was no use. He couldn't lift it. "Need some help, Paul?" Babe asked. "Sure could use a little," Paul replied. "Okay, hop on my back." So Paul climbed onto Babe's broad back and wrapped his legs around his horns. Then Babe stomped his right foot, then his left foot, and then he started walking in circles as fast as he could. Paul grabbed Betsy by the handle and dug his shoulder into her head as hard as he could, and they started digging a new river to replace the old one. At first it went very slowly, but then they started picking up the pace. The axe bit into the ground and carved out a deep trench. Little pebbles flew everywhere and the ground trembled beneath them. "Faster, Babe, faster," Paul shouted, as he dug his shoulder into Babe's thick fur. A little faster, a little higher, a little faster. Babe snorted and puffed out his chest and began to run as fast as he could. Soon they had dug a new river, and it was flowing with fresh, clean water. Betsy was very happy, and she thanked Babe and Paul for saving her. The three friends celebrated with a big feast of roasted elk and berries, and then they all went to sleep. When they woke up the next morning, they continued to work until the sun went down. And by the end of the day, they had cut down all the trees in the canyon. "Well done, Babe," Paul said. "You sure did good today." "Thanks, Paul," Babe replied. "It was really fun to stomp all those trees." And that's the end of that story.